The story of the Italian cruiser Giuseppe Garibaldi is an interesting one. Garibaldi's combat career largely came to nothing, although the ship would escape any major damage. This isn't surprising, because the Italians held Garibaldi and her sister back for the most part. They were leery of losing their most modern cruisers, especially after Cape Matapan. Where her story gets fun, however, is in the Cold War. The Italians, if you know your history, are quite fond of massive rebuilds. Their battleships are the classic example of complete ground-up rebuild for a reason. Garibaldi would continue this trend. Except, this being the Cold War, her rebuild focused much more on missiles. Garibaldi became the first European guided missile cruiser in this time period. That was impressive enough. The Italians proceeded to take things a step further by placing ballistic missile tubes on her stern. There's a reason the title is what it is. I'll admit it's something of an open question if those tubes were ever used for their intended purpose, but it's still impressive and certainly unique. It also perfectly encapsulates the insanity of the early Cold War. After all, who would expect ballistic missile tubes on a pre-war light cruiser? Let's look at the story of that refit now. If you're curious about Garibaldi as a whole, I have a video on her as well. I'll link that in the description. Now, to begin. Giuseppe Garibaldi in the Cold War was an increasingly outdated cruiser. While a fine design for the 1930s, technology was marching on. Her sister ship, Abruzzi, had already received a more minor refit to try and keep up. The Italian Navy, aware of the changing technological climate, wanted to do something more with Garibaldi. You see, by 1953, very little had been done to modernize the cruiser. Mostly improved anti-aircraft guns and newer radar. Definitely good things to have, but not much in the way of keeping her competitive. On the positive side of things, it left the cruiser's hull basically clear for a massive modernization project. Enter 1953, when Garibaldi was decommissioned, pending a decision on how to refit her. This went back and forth for some time, as the Italians tried to figure out a plan. I've never found the details of these arguments, though they might be in a dusty Italian archive somewhere. Ultimately, however, a decision was made by the end of 1954. Garibaldi would be reconstructed as the first European guided missile cruiser, and one of the first of the type in the entire world, for that matter. With this plan in hand, Garibaldi went in for her refit in 1957. Basically everything above the waterline, and quite a bit of her internal spaces, were cut off and pulled out. This would be a rebuild every bit as extensive, if not more so, than the old battleships, complete with a changed hull form at the stern. The cruiser's elegant stern was chopped off and replaced with a transom, presumably to help support her new weaponry. The original superstructure was also gone, replaced with a more modern design. This was matched by emplacements for more modern radar and other electronic equipment. The ship that came out was, in my opinion, much better looking than the American equivalent. I apologize if you like the Albany class as an example, but I much prefer Garibaldi's looks in this case. That aside, the cruiser also lost most of her armor during this process. It was considered surplus to requirements on a ship no longer designed to use her main guns. The cruiser did retain fairly thick deck armor, equally thick barbette armor, and a smaller and thinner central belt. The power plant saw less major changes, mostly in the elimination of 2 boilers and the trunking of the funnels. With a power of 85,000 shaft horsepower and her 1 funnel, Garibaldi could still manage 30 knots. To power all the fancy new electronics, the cruiser also received enough generators to light a city of 200,000 people. Early Cold War electronics were very power hungry. That said, all of this is secondary to the main change, and that was the weaponry. The old 152mm 6-inch guns were removed entirely. The 2 forward turrets were replaced with new twin turrets carrying 135mm 5.3-inch guns. These were contemporary to the cruiser herself, having been used on the refit Doria-class battleships, as well as the Capitani Romani class cruisers. While the guns were old, the mountings were state-of-the-art, and this resulted in a much more capable dual-purpose setup than the 152mm guns ever could be. It was still a stopgap, though, and a reflection of Italy's lack of trust in a pure missile ship. The secondary battery, meanwhile, were brand new 76mm guns. These were dual-purpose as well, but mostly intended for use against aircraft. But, of course, all of this isn't why you're here. You're here for the missiles. Garibaldi lost her two stern turrets, with her aft superstructure becoming a blocky thing to support her missiles, specifically a twin-arm mount for the Terrier missile. This American-designed system was an early style of surface-to-air missile, with the teething issues you could expect of that. Regardless, these missiles were useful, but not the distinctive feature. While there's some conflicting information on exactly when they were fitted, the really interesting bits are the ballistic missile tubes. These were either installed in the major rebuild or later on in 1967. Either way, the cruiser was eventually fit with 4 ballistic missile tubes in her stern. Specifically 4 tubes designed to carry the Polaris missile. So, here you have a cruiser built in the 1930s, refit 30 years later to carry nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. It's rare enough to see this kind of setup, period. Ballistic missiles on a surface ship is incredibly rare. And here you have Italy, of all people, charging in and putting 4 on an antique cruiser. I give them props for sheer dedication to this rebuild, at the least. It doesn't make it any less weird to think about, however. An Italian-like cruiser with the same missiles that first-generation boomer submarines were carrying. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall during that discussion. It's just so completely wild, and yet perfectly Italian at the same time. That said, Garibaldi might never have carried the missiles. This is one of those areas where everything is probably still classified. Garibaldi certainly test-fired Polaris missiles, but I've never found a source confirming, one way or another, if the ship carried them in service. I have seen it said that the Italians never received Polaris missiles in actual service use, with the result that the Italian government developed a homebrew missile to replace the American model. This project would eventually lead into the Alpha missile. And regardless of if Garibaldi carried Polaris or not, the Alpha project is basically Italy going, forget it, we'll do it ourselves. While these missiles would, in turn, never see widespread use, lessons learned from Alpha helped with both the Italian and eventually European space programs. That's not a bad legacy to have in its own right. As for Garibaldi herself, regardless of if the cruiser ever carried ballistic missiles or not, she remained in service until 1971. That's not a bad run for a cruiser designed in the mid-1930s. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.